The day they sold Maren Holt, the sky was the color of a bruise going yellow at the edges, and the town of Calderon smelled like horse sweat and sawdust, and the particular kind of shame that only comes when everyone watches and no one speaks. She stood on the steps of Gideon Burr's auction platform, a raised plank stage he'd had nailed together in front of the land office 2 years prior, when the territory went dry and the desperate started selling things they had no right to sell. And she kept her chin level, because it was the only thing she could keep. Her wrists were not bound. They did not need to be. Burr had made sure of that. He had spoken to every man in Calderon who mattered, and the ones who didn't matter had been paid enough to stay quiet, and the ones who might have helped her had been made to understand that helping her would cost them more than they could afford. Her mother's debt was the reason. That was the story Burr told, and he told it loudly enough that it had become a kind of truth in Calderon, the way untrue things become true when enough people repeat them in enough parlors and saloons and church doorways. Maren's mother, Clara Holt, had borrowed $200 from Burr's lending office 3 winters back, when the creek froze and the cattle died, and there was nothing left to burn for heat but the furniture. Clara had signed a paper. She had not understood the paper. She had understood only that her daughter would not freeze. Clara was in the ground now, 6 months gone, and Burr had arrived at the cabin on the morning of the 3rd day after the burial with the paper in his hand and a smile that went nowhere near his eyes. Maren was 22 years old. She owed a dead woman's debt to a man who had written the terms himself. The crowd in the square was 30 people, maybe more. Some had come because Burr had told them a piece of the Holt property would go with her, a small parcel on the East Ridge that was worth something to the right man. Some had come because they were bored and there was nothing else to watch. A few stood at the back with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the ground, and Maren knew those ones. She had gone to school with 2 of them. One had danced with her mother at the Harvest Festival the year before Clara got sick. None of them moved. Burr stepped up beside her. He smelled like tobacco and bay rum and money, and he was dressed in a town suit that had been pressed that morning, and he carried the kind of confidence that men carry when they have made the rules and paid for the enforcement. He was not a large man physically. He didn't need to be. He had made himself large through debt and patience and the slow accumulation of things other people had been forced to surrender. "Miss Holt," he said, loud enough for the square, "has declined to settle the obligation through alternative means." A few men in the crowd exchanged glances. Alternative means. Maren knew what that phrase had covered. Burr had offered her a way out of the debt 8 days ago, standing in her own kitchen, and she had told him what she thought of it in language that had surprised them both. He had not been angry. That had frightened her more than anger would have. He had simply folded the offer back into his coat, like a letter returned unopened, and said, pleasantly, that they would proceed as planned. The bidding started at $40. Maren kept her eyes on the horizon past the crowd, on the line of flat earth and sky, where the road out of Calderon ran straight for 12 miles before it bent south toward the next county. She had ridden that road with her mother once, years ago, on a cart pulled by a mule that was already dying. She remembered the way the light had sat on the dry grass, orange and heavy, and how her mother had sung a low song that Maren had never heard before or since. She held that memory in her chest now like a coal from a dying fire. It was warm, and it was fading, and it was all she had. 50, 60, 65. The voices came from her left. She did not look. She heard a horse then, at the edge of the square. Not unusual. Calderon was a working town, and horses came and went all day. But this horse stopped, and the man on it did not dismount immediately, and there was something in the quality of the crowd's stillness that changed. A small shift, the way a room shifts when someone unexpected enters. Maren felt it but did not turn to look, because turning would mean moving, and moving would mean acknowledging what was happening to her, and she had decided that she would stand still and keep her chin level and take whatever came. 70, someone said. Then a voice from the back of the square said, quiet and flat and carrying further than it should have. That's enough. The bidding stopped. Maren turned then. The man on the horse was broad-shouldered, in that particular unhurried way that meant the broadness was not performance, just accumulation of physical work done over many years. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples. His clothes were plain and dark, and had seen hard use. He sat the horse like a man who had done nothing else his whole life, easy in the saddle, reins loose in one hand. His eyes, when they found Burr, were a weathered blue, and the expression in them was difficult to read at first. It seemed almost empty, until Maren realized it wasn't empty at all. It was controlled. There was a difference. Burr looked at the man for a moment. Cord Beaumont, he said. Not a greeting, a calculation. This isn't a legal proceeding, Cord said. He was still on the horse. He had not raised his voice. You know that. Half these men know that. You've been trading on the fact that nobody wants the trouble of saying it out loud. Burr's smile did not waver. The Holt debt is a matter of public record. The Holt debt is a matter of a paper signed by a dying woman that wouldn't hold in any territory court with an honest judge behind the bench. Cord looked at the crowd then, not accusingly, just steadily, the way a man looks at a thing he is deciding whether or not to name. If anyone here wants to test that, I'll pay the circuit judge's fee myself. The crowd was quiet. Someone coughed. The man at the far left who had danced with Clara Holt at the Harvest Festival looked up from the ground for the first time. Burr said, You've got no standing here, Beaumont. I've got $400, Cord said, which is more than this crowd's managed between them. He dismounted then, slow and deliberate, and looped the reins around the nearest post. He reached into the inside of his coat and brought out a leather fold. He walked to the platform, not hurrying. The crowd parted for him, not from fear exactly, though fear was a part of it, from something else, the recognition of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through. He looked up at Maren. Miss Holt, he said, my name is Cord Beaumont. I run the Beaumont outfit 12 miles east. I'm not buying you. I'm settling the debt as a legal transaction and ending this. He held up the money toward Burr without looking at him. $200, which is the stated amount, plus interest at the legal rate, which is not the rate on that paper. Someone in this crowd with a pen can write the receipt. Burr's smile had cooled considerably. That's not the agreed... The agreed amount doesn't matter, Cord said, still not looking at Burr, because the agreement doesn't hold. I just told you that. There was a long moment. Maren understood in that moment that Burr was calculating. He was adding up the variables the way he always did. What he could take, what it would cost him, what the crowd would do, what Cord Beaumont was capable of. And somewhere in that calculation, something did not land in his favor, because after 12 seconds that felt considerably longer. He reached out and took the money. Maren did not speak until they were out of the square. Cord had said nothing after the transaction. He had waited while the receipt was written. One of the storekeepers had produced a pen, somewhat shakily, and he had not looked at Burr again, and he had not offered his arm to Maren or gestured for her to follow him. He had simply walked back to his horse and stood by it, and the implicit message was plain enough. She could follow, or she could not, and either way he had done what he came to do. She followed. Her legs felt strange. She had been standing still and rigid for 40 minutes, and the rigidity had gone somewhere deep into the bone, and it was only now, walking, that her body remembered it was allowed to move. When they reached the edge of the square, and the crowd thinned behind them, she said, "Why did you do that?" He was checking the horse's girth strap. He did not look up immediately. Because it was wrong. You don't know me. No. He straightened and looked at her then, briefly. Doesn't change what it was. She looked at his face. The silver at his temples was sharp in the morning light. There was a stillness in his blue eyes that she had noticed in the square, and was noticing again now. A kind of density, like a pool of water that looked shallow, and was not. There was nothing warm in it exactly, but there was nothing cold in it either. It was just honest, in the way that things in the frontier were honest, without decoration. I have nowhere to go, she said. She said it without shame, because she was past shame. She had used up what shame she had standing on that platform. The cabin is Burr's now. He said he'd hold it against the debt, but it was never legally titled in my mother's name anyway. So in practice, he's had it for 6 months and just not moved on it yet. She paused. I have a carpet bag at the boarding house. That's everything. Cord was quiet for a moment. I'm short a cook, he said, and a person who can manage the books. The ranch runs 11 men, and the accounts are behind 3 months. It's work. It pays $12 a month, and there's a room separate from the bunkhouse. He looked at her steadily. It's a practical offer. That's all it is. Maren studied him. She was not naive. She had lived 22 years in a world that manufactured practical offers that was something else underneath, and she had learned to look for the seam between what was said and what was meant. She looked for it now and did not find it, or rather, she found something else. The stillness in his eyes was not the stillness of a man waiting to collect on a favor. It was the stillness of a man who had said what he meant and was prepared to be taken at it, or refused. $12, she said. 12. And the room locks from the inside. All the rooms lock from the inside, he said. I built them myself. She looked at the road ahead, 12 miles east, the same road she had looked at from the platform, the road that ran straight and flat and offered no promises, but also no walls. Her mother's voice came to her, faint as smoke, the wordless song from the dying mule cart years ago. All right, Maren said. The Beaumont outfit sat on a shallow rise of land above a creek that ran clear even in dry years, which was a rarity in that part of the territory. There were 3 structures, a main house, a bunkhouse, and a long, low barn. All of it was plain and functional and slightly battered by weather, but nothing was falling down. The fence lines were clean, the corrals were full of working horses. The creek glittered in the afternoon light through the cottonwoods, and Maren, arriving for the first time in the bed of a supply wagon, while Cord rode ahead, thought that it looked like a place that had been fought for and held. The men watched her arrive without much visible reaction. There were 6 of them in the yard when the wagon came in, dusty from a morning's work, and they looked at her the way working men look at most things, briefly, assessingly, and then back to what they were doing. One of them, a lean man with a sun-dark face and a permanent squint named Dell, caught her eye as she climbed down from the wagon and gave a nod that was not unfriendly. Cord showed her the room. It was small and plain, with a window that faced east, and a narrow iron bed and a peg on the wall, and nothing else. But the walls were solid. The floor was swept, and there was a key on the inside of the door, just as he had said. She put her carpet bag on the bed and stood for a moment in the quiet of it. She had not been in a quiet room in 6 months. Since Clara died, the cabin had been full of Burr's visits and his men's footsteps and the sound of her own fear, which is not a quiet sound, even when it makes no noise. This room had no fear in it. It was just a room, plain and still, with morning light stored up in the eastern window, like a promise waiting to be collected. She pressed her hand flat against the wall, solid, real. She unpacked her bag. The work was what she had been told it was, genuine and demanding, and not without dignity. She cooked for 12, including herself, which meant starting before first light and not sitting down until past midday, And then the accounts in the afternoon, which Cord had not exaggerated. They were behind and badly organized. 3 months of supplier tallies and cattle figures and hands' wages, all mixed together in a wooden crate with no order to them. She spent the first week simply sorting. Cord looked in on her progress once, standing in the doorway of the small room he used as an office, and said nothing beyond a brief nod before he left again. It was, she was beginning to understand, how he expressed most things. Not in words, but in the decision to check rather than not check, to ask rather than not ask, to come back rather than not come back. The men were decent to her. Dell told her on the third morning that her biscuits were the best he'd had since his mother's, which she recognized as the highest compliment available in that language and accepted accordingly. A young hand named Charlie, who was barely 19 and visibly homesick for somewhere back east, took to leaving fresh-cut kindling outside the kitchen door without being asked. She noticed these things. She filed them in the part of herself that had been stripped bare on that auction platform and was cautiously, quietly, beginning to grow something back. Cord himself kept a careful distance, not a cold distance, a respectful one. He ate his meals with the men and spoke when there was something to say and did not push into her hours or her silence. But she noticed that when something heavy needed carrying into the kitchen, it was already done by the time she reached for it. When one of the horses in the far corral turned mean and unpredictable, and she had to pass that corral on her way to the creek for washing water, she found 2 days later that the horse had been moved to a different pen. He said nothing about either of these things. He had, she understood, a particular way of caring that involved almost no mention of itself. 3 weeks in, she found him at the far fence line at dusk, mending a broken post, and she brought him a canteen of water because it was hot, and he'd been out there since mid-morning. He took the canteen and drank and handed it back without ceremony. "Thank you," he said. She stood there a moment, watching the light going down behind the ridge. The grass was gold, and the sky was going copper at the edges, and the creek made a small, steady sound in the silence. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "In town, you said the paper wouldn't hold in an honest court." She paused. "How did you know that?" He drove the post anchor another inch into the ground before he answered. "Burr's done it before. Not in this territory. In the Cargill territory, 2 counties east, before he moved here. A woman named Faraday. She didn't have anyone to say what needed saying." He looked at the fence post. "I knew her family." Maren was quiet. "So you knew what he was doing before it started?" "I knew what he was likely doing. I wasn't certain until I got to town and saw it." He glanced at her sideways. "I would have come sooner if I'd known sooner." She believed him. That was the thing about the stillness in his eyes. It made things easy to believe, not because it was naive or warm, but because it had no angle in it. It was just looking. "The woman in Cargill," Maren said. "What happened to her?" A pause. "She lost the land," he said, "and the next winter was hard." Maren looked at the horizon. The last of the copper was going to grey. "I keep thinking I should be angrier," she said, "about all of it. Burr and the paper and the platform and all of it." "Maybe anger needs a place to land," Cord said. "When you're just trying to stay standing, there's no room for it." She looked at him. "Is that something you learned yourself, or did you read it somewhere?" The corner of his mouth moved, barely. It might have been the wind. "Both," he said, "in that order." The threat came back, as it always does in country like that, in the form of a man on a horse and a second man behind him, arriving at the Beaumont gate on a Tuesday morning when Cord was out on the north pasture and only Dell and Charlie were in the yard. Maren was in the kitchen when she heard the voices. She came to the door and saw Burr on a grey horse, dressed in his town suit even out here, and beside him a larger man she did not recognize, heavy through the shoulders, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to men hired to be still until they are not. Burr saw her and smiled his smile. "Miss Holt," he said, "I find I need to revisit the matter of the East Ridge parcel." She came out of the kitchen and stood on the step. Her hands were floury. She did not wipe them. "The debt was settled," she said. "You wrote the receipt." "The debt was settled," he agreed pleasantly. "The land parcel was a separate matter in the original instrument. Cord Beaumont paid the cash obligation. He did not pay for the property." He reached into his coat and produced a paper. "I have a legal instrument here that says the East Ridge parcel, comprising 11 acres, passes to me in satisfaction of a separate clause in the original agreement. Signed by Clara Holt." Maren felt the cold move through her. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. The kind of cold that comes when you understand that a thing has been planned for a long time and you have only just seen the plan. Dell had gone very still near the corral fence. Charlie had not moved. "That clause wasn't in the paper I read," Maren said. "It was in the addendum." "There was no addendum." Burr's smile held steady. "I have the documentation, Miss Holt. If you'd like to contest it, you're welcome to hire a lawyer. The nearest one is in Ellsworth, which is 40 miles. He nodded at her pleasantly. "I'll give you until Friday." He turned the horse. Maren said, "Stop." Her voice came out harder than she expected. Burr turned back, mildly curious. "My mother signed one paper," Maren said. "She signed it in front of 2 witnesses, both of whom are still living in Calderon. An addendum requires its own signature and its own witnesses. If that paper doesn't have both of those things, dated on the same day as the original, in the handwriting of the same clerk, then it is a forgery. And forgery carries a penalty that will interest the circuit judge considerably more than a debt dispute." The smile went still. Not gone, but still. "You've been busy," Burr said. "I've been doing the accounts," Maren said. "It turns out I'm good with numbers." There was a silence that had real weight in it. The large man on the horse beside Burr had shifted slightly, and Dell at the fence had noticed, and Maren was aware of all of it with a clarity that surprised her. The distances, the positions, the way the morning light was coming in from the southeast and hitting the East Ridge behind the house in a way that made the 11 acres visible, gold and green and quietly there. Then hoofbeats on the path from the north, and Cord was there, coming in at a canter, pulling up short of the gate. He read the scene in the time it took to stop the horse. His eyes went from Burr to the large man, to Dell, to Maren, and then they stayed on Maren. "Miss Holt," he said, and the question in it was plain. "Mr. Burr has produced a document claiming a separate land clause in my mother's debt instrument," Maren said. "I was just explaining why it's fraudulent." Cord looked at Burr. "She's right about the witness requirement," he said. "I checked the statutes last month." Burr was quiet for several seconds. The smile had gone entirely now. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is," Cord said. Not loudly, just with a finality that sat in the air the way a closed door sits in a hallway. "Because if you come back here with that paper, or any paper like it, I'll ride to Ellsworth myself, and I'll bring the circuit judge back on a stage, and you'll explain in an open court why 3 of your previous debt instruments have the same addendum clause in different handwriting from the original, which I expect the Faraday family in Cargill County would be interested to hear about as well." Burr looked at him. The large man looked at Burr. Burr turned his horse without another word and rode back down the path, and the large man rode after him, and the sound of hooves faded down the road toward Calderon until there was only the creek and the wind and the cottonwoods moving in the morning light. Dell let out a breath from the corral fence. Charlie sat down on the nearest post. Maren stood on the step with floury hands, and the cold still going out of her slowly, like heat leaving stone after sunset. Cord dismounted and led the horse into the yard. He stopped near the step and looked at her. "You knew about the statutes," he said. It was not quite a question. I looked them up in the copy of the territorial code in your office, the one on the shelf behind the ledger crate. She met his eyes. I hope that was all right. It's all right, he said. She could feel the morning receding, the weight of Burr's presence lifting from the yard like a weather front moving east. She became aware of how her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, she understood, but from the aftermath of not shaking when she had needed not to shake. Cord saw it. He did not mention it. He looked at the horizon instead, giving her the courtesy of not witnessing, and said, "He won't come back." "You're sure?" "He's a man who runs when the cost gets real. He's been running from county to county for 10 years. He'll find somewhere else." He glanced at her. "It's over." She looked at the East Ridge, gold in the morning. 11 acres of thin soil and grass and whatever her mother had believed she was buying with the signing of her name. Belonging, probably. The right to be here. The right not to be moved. "Thank you," Maren said. Again. He shook his head once. "You did most of it yourself. You checked the statutes last month." "I was planning ahead," he said. She looked at him, the silver at his temples, the weathered blue of his eyes in the bright morning, the stillness that had begun, over these weeks, to feel less like distance and more like the particular quality of a person who had learned to hold things carefully. "Why did you check them?" she said. "Last month, before he came back." He was quiet a moment, a long moment. The creek ran in the cottonwoods. The horses in the corral moved and settled. "Because I wanted to know you were safe," he said, "when you weren't looking." She had no answer for that. She did not have the words for what moved through her at the saying of it. Something that was not relief exactly, and not gratitude exactly. Something older and quieter, like a hand finding a door handle in the dark and finding it solid. She nodded. That was all. He nodded back. Then she went inside to finish the biscuits, because they were still in the pan, and the men would be in before noon, and there was work to do. And she had learned in these weeks that work was not an escape from feeling, but a container for it, a way of keeping a thing safe while it grew. By the time the first hard frost came to the Beaumont outfit, the accounts were current and the records were in order, and the East Ridge parcel had been surveyed and titled in Maren Holt's name by a circuit clerk who came through Calderon in October and who had been made to understand, by Cord Beaumont's written request, that the matter was straightforward and the paperwork was a formality. Burr was gone from Calderon by then. Quietly, the way men like Burr go. No announcement, just an empty office and a locked door and a for lease sign in the window, and the various people he had indebted, discovering that the holder of their papers had moved on, and the papers themselves were worth less than their ink. A few of them came to Maren over the following weeks, not for anything specific, just to sit in her kitchen and drink coffee and be among people who understood what it was like to be in a room with that smile and that quiet and the particular kind of fear it produced. She made them coffee and did not rush them out. Cord said nothing about the people who came and went, but she noticed that he always made sure the coffee tin was full. On the first morning after the frost, she came out before first light to start the kitchen fire and found him already there, sitting on the step with 2 cups of coffee, which was not something he had ever done before. She sat beside him. He handed her the second cup. They watched the frost-dark land go slowly blue, and then gold, and then bright as the sun came up over the East Ridge, over the 11 acres that were hers, over the cottonwoods silver with ice along the creek. She thought about her mother, the dying mule cart, the low, wordless song in the orange evening light, the way Clara had looked at the flat land as they drove through it, not with hope or sorrow exactly, but with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been knocked down enough times to know that the land itself was not the enemy, that the land was just land, and what mattered was the choosing of where to stand and the holding of that ground. She had stood her ground. She was still standing. Cord said quietly, "There's a thing I want to say." She waited. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else," he said. "The title to the ridge is yours, and the work is good work, and I'm not asking you to think about any other reason." He paused. His hands were wrapped around the cup. They were hands, she had noticed over these weeks, that had done a great deal and regretted little. "But I'd like it if you stayed. Not for the accounts, and not because the biscuits are what Dell says they are, which they are." He looked at her sideways. "For the other reason, which I'm not going to make a speech about, because that's not how I do things." Maren looked at the ridge, gold and clear and hers. "I know how you do things," she said. He nodded. "Then you know I mean it." "I know you mean it." The creek ran in the cottonwoods. The horses in the corral breathed steam into the cold morning air. Somewhere on the north pasture, a bird called once and went quiet. She put her hand on the step between them. He put his on top of it. Neither of them moved for a long time, and neither of them needed to, because some things in the world are spoken best in the language of staying still, of choosing to stay still, of understanding that the ground beneath you is solid and the person beside you is real, and the morning, cold and clear and full of light, is going to keep coming as long as you are here to receive it. The dust settles. The danger has passed. But every story leaves something behind, a feeling, a question, a memory. What did this one leave with you? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are in this world tonight, because these stories travel far, and I want to know every corner they reach. If you felt something, like this video, share it with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe, because the next tale is already waiting in the shadows. I'll see you there.